Two cities. They sit in the same valley. They share the same climate, the same ancestors, the same diseases, and the same cultural roots. A resident in the city on the north side earns an average of $30,000 a year, lives to be 80, and has access to paved roads and property rights. A resident in the city on the south side, just a few feet away through a fence, earns 1/10 of that, lives a decade less, and navigates a world of bribery and crumbling infrastructure. This isn't a difference in geography. It isn't a difference in work ethic. It is the visible, physical scar of an invisible machine. The line between them isn't just a border. It is the exact point where the engine of prosperity dies, and the trap begins. This disparity is not an accident of history. It is a feature of design. We are looking at the mechanics of failure, the specific, repeatable systems that keep nations locked in the dark while their neighbors light up the world. Welcome to Documentary Dollar. Today, we aren't just looking at poverty. We are dismantling the engine that creates it. We often talk about poverty as if it is a passive state, as if it's just the natural starting point of humanity that some nations haven't managed to climb out of yet. We treat it like a lack of resources, or bad luck, or poor geography. But that explanation falls apart when you look at the data. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. By all geological accounts, it should be one of the richest nations on Earth. It sits on an estimated $24 trillion of untapped mineral wealth. Yet, the average citizen lives in destitution. Compare that to Japan, a volcanic island chain with almost no natural resources, which became an economic titan. If geography were destiny, the map of global wealth would look essentially inverted. The mystery we are solving today is why the solutions never seem to work. For 70 years, the Western world has poured trillions of dollars in aid into the developing world. We have sent experts, built dams, and forgiven debts. And yet, the gap remains. In many cases, it widens. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth that economists often whisper but politicians rarely say out loud. Poverty in these nations is not a failure of the system. For the people running these nations, the poverty is the point. To understand this, we have to look at the institution gap. History offers us a brutal echo of this. In the 1600s, colonial powers established two very different types of colonies. In places like North America, where the land was vast and the indigenous labor force was difficult to enslave or control, they created settler colonies. They had to incentivize settlers to work, so they offered property rights, voting, and checks on power. But in places like Latin America and Africa, where the soil was rich for plantation crops and the population was dense enough to be coerced, they set up extractive colonies. The goal was simple: take everything out, put nothing back. The tragedy isn't that this happened 400 years ago. The tragedy is that when the colonizers left, the local elites who took over didn't dismantle the extraction machine. They just moved into the driver's seat. They kept the extractive institutions because those institutions were incredibly efficient at doing exactly what they were designed to do: funnel wealth from the many to the few. We are not looking at developing nations. We are looking at nations that are being actively held back. The question is, how does the trap actually work? To understand the mechanism, we have to strip away the complex economic jargon and look at the incentives. Imagine you are the dictator of a resource-rich nation. You have oil, or diamonds, or copper. Your goal is not to make your people rich. Your goal is to stay in power. To stay in power, you need the loyalty of a very small circle of people: the generals, the police chiefs, and the key bureaucrats. We call this the winning coalition. Here is where it gets strange. If you actually try to develop your nation, if you build good schools, encourage startups, and create a free market, you create a massive problem for yourself. A wealthy, educated, independent citizenry is dangerous. They demand rights. They demand representation. They become a rival power center. This is the dictator's dilemma. Economic growth requires creative destruction. It replaces old, inefficient industries with new, efficient ones. But those old industries are often owned by your friends, your generals, and your political allies. If you let a young tech entrepreneur disrupt the state-owned monopoly, you lose the loyalty of the monopoly owner. And if you lose their loyalty, you get overthrown. So, the rational move for you, the mechanism of survival, is to actively block prosperity. You stifle innovation not because you are stupid, but because you are smart. You keep the barriers to entry high so only your cronies can do business. You keep the courts corrupt so property rights are never secure, meaning no one can get rich without your permission. Let's look at the timeline of how this plays out in a resource trap. It starts with the discovery of a commodity, let's say, oil. Suddenly, the government doesn't need to tax its people to make money. It just needs to drill. This breaks the fundamental contract of democracy: no taxation without representation. If the government doesn't need your taxes, it doesn't need to listen to you. The money floods in. The currency value skyrockets. This makes it impossible for other industries like agriculture or manufacturing to export their goods because they become too expensive for the rest of the world to buy. This is known as Dutch disease. The rest of the economy dies, leaving the nation entirely dependent on that one resource. Now, the trap snaps shut. Because the entire economy is just one pot of oil money, politics becomes a death match. There is no private sector to work in. If you want wealth, you must be in the government. The fight for the palace becomes a fight for survival. This leads to civil wars, coups, and purges. In this system, corruption is not a side effect. Corruption is the operating system. You have to let your generals loot the treasury, or they will find a leader who will. You have to let the police take bribes, because you can't afford to pay them a real salary. We see this mechanism perfectly preserved in the concept of the vicious circle. Extractive political institutions, where power is concentrated, lead to extractive economic institutions, where wealth is concentrated. The wealth buys more power, and the power secures more wealth. It is a closed loop. Breaking it requires a shock so massive that the elites lose their grip. But recently, something has happened that is tightening that grip harder than ever before. We often think of these systemic traps as relics of the Cold War or the colonial era. But the scary reality is that the trap is being upgraded. We are witnessing the birth of extractive institutions 2.0, triggered by the global transition to green energy and the rise of digital surveillance. Right now, the world is desperate for cobalt, lithium, copper, and rare earth elements. This is the new gold rush. And where are these resources found? Disproportionately in nations that are already caught in the trap. In the past, extraction required armies and physical occupation. Today, it is done through debt trap diplomacy and opaque contracts. Foreign powers and huge multinational conglomerates are approaching these fragile nations with a new offer. They will build the infrastructure, the roads, the ports, the digital networks, in exchange for exclusive access to the mines. But here is the catch. The contracts are often signed in secret. The debts incurred are sovereign debts, meaning the people are on the hook for them. But the money often bypasses the public treasury and goes straight into prestige projects or the pockets of the elite. This creates a scenario where a nation can be developing on paper. Shiny new airports, massive highways, while the population becomes more impoverished. The GDP goes up, but the GNI, the income that actually stays in the country, flatlines. Furthermore, technology has handed the winning coalition a weapon that dictators of the past could only dream of. In the 20th century, repressing a population was expensive. You needed spies, informants, and secret police on every corner. Today, you just need software. Digital authoritarianism allows these regimes to monitor dissent, control the flow of information, and freeze the bank accounts of opposition leaders with a keystroke. The cost of oppression has plummeted. The cost of revolution has skyrocketed. We are seeing a divergence. In the West, technology has largely been a force for decentralization and efficiency. In the extractive nations, technology is being used to centralize control. It is hardening the shell of the regime. The vicious circle is being reinforced with steel and silicon. This brings us to the present moment. We are not just watching history repeat itself. We are watching it accelerate. The demand for green energy is arguably the greatest economic shift of our lifetimes, and it is threatening to turn entire continents into mere service stations for the developed world's electric vehicles. So, where does this lead? If the trap is tightening, What happens next? We can break the consequences down into 3 distinct shifts that we will see in the next decade. First, look at the institutional shift. The era of the blank check from institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is coming to a turbulent end. For decades, these institutions loaned money with conditions. We will give you cash, but you must clean up your corruption and open your markets. It didn't always work, but it was a pressure valve. Now, those conditions are being bypassed. New lenders are entering the market. Sovereign wealth funds and state-backed banks from the East, who offer loans with no strings attached regarding human rights or democracy. This removes the external pressure for reform. We are going to see a bifurcation of the global financial system. Nations will choose their orbit, the transparent, conditional Western system, or the opaque, transactional alternative. This will insulate dictators from international pressure, making regimes more durable and less responsive to their people. Second, watch for the governmental reaction, resource nationalism. As the populations of these trapped nations realize they are being sold out, we will see a rise in populist leaders who promise to take back the resources. We are already seeing nations banning the export of raw ore, demanding that processing happens within their borders. While this sounds good in theory, in nations with weak institutions, nationalization usually just means moving the assets from a foreign corporation directly into the hands of the ruling family. It changes the beneficiary, but it doesn't break the trap. We will see a wave of asset seizures and contract renegotiations that will spike the price of global commodities, causing inflation in your grocery store and electronics store, while failing to actually alleviate poverty on the ground. Third, and most importantly, the human consequence, the Great Migration. If the exit from poverty, economic growth, is blocked, people will choose the other exit, physical departure. The systemic failure of these nations is the primary driver of the global migration crisis. As the gap between the extractive world and the inclusive world widens, and as digital media shows the global poor exactly what they are missing, the pressure to leave will become explosive. We are moving from a world of immigration to a world of exodus. This will reshape the politics of the developed world, fueling nativism and border anxieties, creating a feedback loop of isolationism. The consequence isn't just sadness in a faraway land. It is global instability. A nation trapped in poverty is a breeding ground for extremism, a petri dish for pandemics, and a source of geopolitical volatility that spills over every border. We have looked at the history, the mechanism, and the consequences. But there is one final, uncomfortable insight that reframes everything. We like to believe that the world is gradually moving toward justice. We like to believe that given enough time, every nation will become a democracy with a free market. We call it modernization theory. But the deep truth is that wealth is not the natural state of nations. Entropy is. Building an inclusive institution, a system where laws apply to everyone, where patents protect inventors, where contracts are honored, is incredibly difficult. It requires a distribution of power that goes against every selfish instinct of human nature. The trap is the default. The miracle is the escape. When we look at a poor nation, we aren't looking at a broken version of a rich nation. We are looking at a perfectly functioning system designed for a different purpose. We are looking at a machine that is optimizing for control rather than growth. The elites in these nations are not failing. They are succeeding. They have calculated that a poor, dependent, and suppressed population is safer for their survival than a rich, demanding, and independent one. They would rather slice a small pie entirely for themselves than share a growing pie with you. This realization changes how we must look at the solution. You cannot fix this with aid. You cannot fix this with charity. You cannot fix this by sending bags of rice. You can only fix it by changing the incentives, by making the cost of repression higher than the cost of inclusion. Until the winning coalition needs the people to survive, the people will continue to starve. The systems that hold nations back are durable, but they are not invincible. History shows they can crack, but usually it happens when the money runs out. And speaking of money running out, there is one specific economic event that terrifies these regimes more than any revolution: hyperinflation. But how does a currency actually die? How does a piece of paper go from being worth a house to being worth less than the ink printed on it? If you want to see the mechanics of that collapse, click this video right here. It's the other side of the coin, and you need to see it.